Alright, so I've been putting this video off for well over a year now. I've had a Google Doc full of notes that's been slowly building, and the reason it's taken so long is I don't really know where to start, and worse, I don't really know where to stop. Um, Most of the sites that I've worked on in my career have either been small and ephemeral or have been so huge that there's not enough published for me to make videos on them. Um, it's a long process that takes years to do the kinds of analyses that we end up doing. So there's one site that I did really early on in my career. I was actually a block supervisor on it for some dumb reason about 3 years out of college. It's called the William Springs site in northern Alabama on Redstone Arsenal around Huntsville area. Today I want to at least start a series of videos on that site and what we learned from it. William Spring is a late Middle Woodland village site with a lot of earlier components attached to it. It's on a hilltop next to a creek that flows into the Tennessee River. Now, longtime viewers of the channel may have noticed at some point that I haven't really talked a lot about the Woodland period, and that's about to change a lot. So for this video, I'm planning on just covering some of the background, the methodology that we used, and then get into the chipped stone lithic assemblages and the analysis that we did on that. I plan to make the next video on the ceramics and the paleoethnobotanical material, the plant remains, and the faunal material. And then the last video, I want to talk about the pit features themselves and maybe some of the other miscellaneous artifacts that didn't get their own section, and then try to wrap this thing up with some general overview, conclusions, and summary. Now, the reason we excavated this site in the first place was that it had been turned into a wastewater treatment facility back in the early 20th century, and it was found that the soils had developed a lot of contamination that were getting into the groundwater, and so they needed to decontaminate these soils. And that process was going to destroy any archaeological material that was found in the ground. So this is one of two times in my entire archaeological career that I've been given the responsibility by indigenous descendants to exhume human remains for repatriation. We get them out of the ground, we get them back to them, they rebury them. That's how rare this is. In the last 12 or 13 years, it's only been on 2 sites, really, that I've dealt with human remains. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say on that subject. All right, so moving on to methods. Now, depending on where you are on the site, there's 5 or 6 major stratigraphic groups, layers. But these can be broken down into 3 major stratigraphic groupings. There's the upper plow zone. All of this area had been farmland before it was turned into Redstone Arsenal. And then below that, you've got the midden deposit, this like black, greasy material that's full of artifacts, but it's all just kind of a jumbled mess. There's not really any stratigraphy to it. And then under that, there's the subsoil. Now, by the time that I got there, the midden had already pretty extensively sampled in 1 by 1 meter excavation units. And we weren't really getting a lot of good information out of that. So what it was decided, and not we, but the people in charge of this project, what was decided was that we would take a mechanical scraper, an end loader, and scrape off the midden so that we could get to the pit features underneath, the fire pits and the storage pits and all the rest of that material that's underneath the midden overburden. These pits are dug into the subsoil, and they numbered in the hundreds. I think we got up to number 700 and something. I'll have to go back and check the notes to get an actual count. But these pits are a much better temporal and contextual unit to deal with than the midden, because you have a pit, it's dug, material is thrown into it, it gets sealed over on top, and so you've got these capsules of information that are distributed across the site that it's a lot easier to get confident radiocarbon dates and artifact associations between these things. So during the mechanical scrape, when we would encounter a feature, and it usually just appears as a black stain in the very red clay subsoil, we'd take a trowel, like this one, clean scrape the top of it, throw a pin flag in it, and give it a number. And then when we were ready to excavate them, we would set up a bisect line across the top of them. So 2 nails and a piece of string that cuts the feature in half. Next thing we do is we take a piece of surveying equipment called a total station, and we're going to take a series of points on the center of the feature, the nails where we set up the bisect line, and then the perimeter. And we were able to use this to make a 3-dimensional map of the features on the site. After that, we would dig out one half of the feature, one side of the bisect line, and send that down to the water screens. In doing that, we would take the fill out, we'd measure it by liter, put it into buckets, tie a piece of like pink flagging tape with all of the contextual information that would go into a wheelbarrow and get barrowed down to the wet screens. And there, what they're doing is they've got these troughs. They are going to dump this fill into the trough that's full of water, get that soil in suspension, and then run that through a 1/4-inch mesh screen for artifact recovery. And that helps to break up the clays, and it really improves artifact recovery. The other half of each of those features is going into a flotation tank, which I've talked about before, but the basic idea is that you get the water into this big water tank where the water is cycling down and getting dragged out of like a spigot down to the bottom of the tank into a similar 1/4-inch mesh hardware cloth screen. But we've also got we call it a bubbler. It's basically another hose that's running up and spraying water in an upward direction, and that current grabs the light fraction, the burn plant materials, and makes them float to the top, and so those get scraped off. And so we're getting both the heavy fraction of the artifacts, the ceramics, the lithics, animal bone, things like that, and we're also getting that light fraction of botanical material to be sent back to the lab. And we're getting a 50% sample of every feature within every stratigraphic depositional zone within it. So that was the standard operating procedure for every feature across the site. And those plant materials are really important because this is after the onset of the Eastern Agricultural Complex, which I've talked about before, those plants like the sunflowers and the maygrasses and the chenopodium. And so we're not dealing with hunter-gatherers at this point. These are farmers that are living off this creek upstream from the Tennessee River Valley. And that's going to become important in a later video. All right, if I'm going to have to do the rest of this as a talking head, the editing is going to drive me absolutely nuts, so I'm switching to voiceover mode. The first aspect of lithics that we have to talk about is materials. The area around Redstone Arsenal is absolutely lousy with excellent high-quality toolstone, especially the blue Fort Payne and the gray Tuscumbia cherts. There's also Bangor chert nodules, which can be more blue-green and have translucent chalcedony inclusions, and the inferior yellowish Monteagle cherts. These are the fundamental materials that are used to make chipstone tools in this area. I already have a couple of videos on the channel on the basics of lithic analysis, but we're going to try to speed run a refresher that's oriented around the William Spring site specifically. Now, the first thing to talk about is cores. Cores are the starting point for making stone tools, and there are several forms. You've got your tested tabs, which are naturally flat pieces, and tested cobbles, which are more rounded, and we generally call them tested pieces only when they have 2 to 3 flakes knocked off of them, but no more. Those flakes are functional as informal cutting tools right off the bat, or off the core as it were. If they have 4 or more flakes, we class them as full cores, which can take multiple forms. Amorphous cores are covered with random flakes. Bifacial cores have flakes removed on either side and can eventually be made into a finished tool, but you're getting lots of other expedient tools as a part of the reduction process. There are also pieces called blade cores, which are cone-shaped, and these are much more common in the Eurasian knapping traditions. We don't much get them here in North America. It's a biface culture here. We do, however, get these microblade cores, which have had very small flakes removed in parallel patterns, and the flakes coming off these things are less than a centimeter long. The material that's being knocked off these cores and tested tabs is called debitage. A lot of the earliest research on chipstone technology was done in France, so we inherited a bunch of that nomenclature. Traditionally, we break up the general debitage into primary, secondary, and tertiary flakes, based mostly on the amount of weathered cortex on the dorsal surface of the flake. So primary flakes have about 50% cortex, secondary flakes have less than 50%, and tertiary flakes have no cortex. Within tertiary flakes, you also have bifacial thinning flakes, which are long and thin. If the flakes have parallel sides and are more than 3 times as long as they are wide, that's called a blade flake or a prismatic blade. The most fundamental chipstone tools are just to utilize debitage. Those flakes that were knocked off are razor sharp and require no modification. It's basically like using a box cutter blade between your thumb and forefinger. They're super effective, and sometimes these flakes are kept and resharpened, making them retouched flake tools, which is mostly what I used to make that bone pin a few weeks back. More formal tools generally fall under the category of bifaces. These are those spear points that your granddad called arrowheads. Working backwards from the finished spear, you have the stage 3 preform, which is a finished point but without the notches or stem. Before that is the preform 2, which is generally half as thick as it is wide and has flake scars showing extensive thinning. Before that is the stage 1 preform, which is just a core which has been flaked to have a cutting surface all the way around the entire perimeter. Essentially, it's a more refined bifacial core. At William Spring, most of the cores and core fragments were still at stage 1, with some inherent defect in the material or production flaw that prompted the napper to discard the piece before investing any more time into it. The bifaces that survived to stage 3 are candidates to be made into what we call PP/Ks, or projectile point knives, which can be culturally diagnostic. I'll start with the earliest types and move through time on this. Moving forward, I'm going to be using a lot of technical terminology that I've covered in this video here, so if you're not familiar with the lithic analysis terms already, you might want to pause and give this a look. The oldest points we found were 2 from the Big Sandy tradition, which is an early archaic side notch type. This is followed by the Kirk cluster, which is going to take some time to flesh out. 2 were Kirk corner notch points, which is the classic Kirk form. They're generally flat in profile and have a straight base that is generally ground. And they've got big excavate blades. Kirk stemmed are similar, but have a stem instead of notches, obviously. Kirk serrated have these teeth in the blades and are more plano-convex in profile. Pine trees and plevnas are also corner notch variants that tend to have serrated blades. This brings us to the decator type, which includes my favorite point from this entire site, the hypertrophic decator. This specimen is the size of my palm, expertly thinned with rounded barbs and a heavily ground and polished base that was made by burination. The wildest part of this piece is that it has multiple phases of patination, which means one of 2 things. Either it was made from an even older biface from the Paleo-American period, or the napper was able to retain a thin layer of discolored material between the cortex and the chert below. At the time, I thought the first possibility was the most obvious, but now I'm a little more inclined to the latter, although both are still totally possible, based on the photos that I still have of it. In total, the Kirk cluster is represented by 12 specimens. A single bifurcated point fragment was also recovered, and these points follow the Kirk horizon and precede the transition to the Middle Archaic when the Morrow Mountain phase emerged. I've discussed this before in one of my really early videos, but it bears repeating that there seems to be a massive abandonment of the Southeast towards the end of the early Archaic period. And when people come back, they bring the Morrow Mountain material culture with them. On the eastern side of the Appalachians, the Morrow Mountain point tends to be made of low-quality quartz. Having made quartz points myself, this makes total sense. The short, rounded stem that typifies the Morrow Mountain point is one of the few shapes that a napper can reliably make on that material. Personally, I think the contracting stem was invented because it's achievable on any kind of toolstone, but here in North Alabama, the Morrow Mountain points are made of good local chert. There is another type that tends to show up alongside Morrow Mountain points, and these are called EVA. They're generally similar, but tend to be better made, and the stems are finished with shallow basal notches at the shoulder. Before moving on, I want to point out that we spent about an hour in the lab arguing over what the hell this particular point was. I'm glad to see it here in the Morrow Mountain cluster, but it certainly is far from typical. Those serrations are extremely abnormal. While Morrow Mountain points tend to be found on both terrace and upland sites, Sykes points are associated with terraces above the Tennessee River specifically. They're not generally found in the uplands. They have a short, squarish stem and are thought to be the precursor of the Benton type. Benton points have slightly longer square stems with a biconvex cross-section, and they tend to be made out of Fort Payne chert. The Big Slough variant, where the corners of the stem are rounded, and the Buzzard Roost Creek variant has a deeply incurvate base. In total, there were 25 Benton cluster points in the assemblage. Moving on to the late Archaic, the Ledbetter cluster forms the main point style, with Elora, Maples, and Pickwick Ledbetter types representing variants. The bases of these points tend to be much narrower with relation to the overall width of the blade. They also tend to be very broad-headed early on, and specimens made on high-quality material tend to have shallow serrations. The late Archaic is the time period when we see the first evidence of plant domestication in the eastern woodlands, with crops like sunflower and maygrass. These early domesticates formed a major component of the economic base in the subsequent Woodland Period. This is also about the same time that neighbors to the south and west began experimenting with the manufacture of pottery. We'll get into that in a later video. The onset of the Woodland Period is kind of hazy. In terms of material culture, it's pretty similar to the late Archaic, but there's less interregional connectivity. The social networks associated with Poverty Point fall apart, and things get kind of quiet. The points from this period fall under the Flint Creek type. It's generally similar to the Pickwick Ledbetter family, and in fact, started in the late Archaic, and I suspect the Pickwick Ledbetters also bleed into the early Woodland. These are mostly expanding stemmed points with some minor serration on the blades and maybe a bit thicker on average, but not radically different. The Middle Woodland Period was a return to complex social networks across the eastern woodlands and is associated with the expansion of the Hopewell Complex. Mound construction has been practiced for thousands of years in pockets of the eastern U.S. at this point, but in the Middle Woodland it became more of a widespread practice. The local form of Hopewell in the Tennessee River Valley is called the Capina culture, which is named after the copper and galena artifacts placed in the graves. It's just the words copper and galena smushed together. The Capina Complex is also associated with the Capina lancelet points. The typical Capina has straight sides that come to a point on one end and kind of constrict a little bit at the haft end. There are also more triangular variations. A couple of things to point out with the spread of this is that if H is really a Capina triangular, then it's been reworked into some other kind of special tool with that big notch taken out of the side. And J has had one face of it exploded in fire, as we can see from the telltale potletting on the surface. That's what happens when water inside the stone boils. In all, there's about 16 of these Capina cluster or Middle Woodland triangular cluster points at Williams Spring. These numbers are about to get a lot bigger. So after the Capina phase, we enter what the authors have called the Williams Spring phase. They're defining a new temporal affiliation that's a local manifestation of a broader post-Capina cultural phenomenon. There are two main points in this phase: the Swan Lake projectile with 102 specimens and the Benjamin Knives with 36 specimens. The Swan Lakes are small and stemmed with a thick blade that is more like a bodkin arrow than a broadhead. The bases of these points regularly still have cortex remaining on them. Honestly, this is where we get into the weeds of trying to split frogs' pubes over point typology, and one of the reasons I've put this off for so long. Swan Lake points are traditionally considered part of a point cluster called Lancelet Expanding Stemmed, or LES. These are contemporaneous with and extremely similar to the lanceolate spike cluster. I'll usually just call these the spike cluster, which the spike cluster is also very like a bodkin arrow. However, when the analysts on this report conducted a Spearman's row test, which is a statistical test, on the Swan Lake points occurring in the same depositional zones within the features, they found that the strongest correlations were between Swan Lake points and other lancelet expanding stemmed points, not the spike clusters, as well as with Benjamin knife points, which we'll get to in a bit. They're only weakly correlated with the spike cluster points proper, despite the fact that morphologically, Swan Lakes are very similar to spike cluster points. So is this an artifact of these similar points being misidentified? Does it even really matter? Believe me when I tell you that whether or not Swan Lake is actually a spike cluster point is the stuff of colossal archaeological brawls at conferences. We're getting close to the point where the usefulness of the point type concept starts to fall apart. It does us all good to remember that point types are not real. They're just a useful heuristic tool that helps us to understand massive data sets and organize things through time. However, Alexander et al., the authors, Lawrence Alexander, Orion, Kroulek, Max Schneider, they concluded from this statistical test that Swan Lake points show up while the Capina family of triangular points was starting to phase out, and it lasted a while after the spike cluster points were phased in. So this is a point type that is bridging this gap between the Capina and the spike cluster. It is also the opinion of the authors that this Swan Lake type represents a transitional phase where both atlatls and bows were being used for projectiles. Remember that I worked for this company for over a year. I wrote sections of this report. I am squinting really hard at this interpretation of the data. On the one hand, there are some things going on at this time in the Woodland period and in this region where that would make a lot of sense for the bow to be introduced. But at the same time, I'm still trying to decide if we have anything close to the data resolution we need to securely make that claim. I haven't had my hands in this for, almost 10 years now. I'm not sure. Jumping over to those Benjamin types. These are especially interesting. For all the world, these would look to the average person like some kind of mid to late stage preform. Most of them are vaguely oval shaped with a straight base. Most still have some cortex on them, especially at the basal end, just like Swan Lake points. There's no notching or stems on them. Most have minimal pressure flaking, and the majority are made of local Monteagle chert. They're just kind of a mess, and they're not well represented in most published work, probably because they've been regularly misidentified as preform fragments. The main authors provide several excerpts from local site reports that describe these bifaces as late-stage preforms rather than as formally typed Benjamin knives. When they look at the edges, there's often evidence of grinding where the handle was attached, and they report use wear and resharpening marks along the blade above the haft line. The most common form of damage that would prompt discard was lateral snap fractures, which may suggest a prying action. In the subsequent Bell Hill phase, we start to see those spike cluster points I talked about earlier, very similar conceptually to the Swan Lake points. You get these same spike points to the north in the Owl Hollow phase around the Duck and the Elk Rivers in Tennessee, and it's also present in the Miller phase over in Mississippi. My impression of these points, both the Bradley spikes and the Swan Lakes, is that their design is conducive to mass production, and the design is an efficient use of material. Very little waste compared to something like a Kirk. After Bell Hill, the only point types were from the Late Woodland Mississippian Triangular, or LWMT cluster, which is unequivocally an arrowhead type. They're too small for spears or anything else, and we've only got 2 of them. This bar graph illustrates the number of PPKs in each major cluster category, with the early Archaic in white, the Middle Archaic in light yellow, the Late Archaic in dark yellow, the Early Woodland in light blue, the Middle Woodland in dark blue, and the Late Woodland and Mississippian in aqua. I'll get much deeper into chronology in a later section, but I want to go ahead and go over this timeline for the Middle Woodland to contextualize this situation. The bars in black are the date ranges for those woodland point types in other reports, both professional and academic. The red portions are AMS carbon dates coming from our work at William Spring. Some refer to point types, but most are referencing specific feature numbers. For instance, feature 636 and feature 327 contained Benjamin knives. Dated Swan Lake points came from feature 629 and 327. And this whole bar brackets the age of Swan Lake, extending the type's age range up to this point here. This brings us to the functional analysis. Back in the 90s, an archaeologist named Michael Schott compiled a bunch of measurement data on stone points that were still hafted, so he knew if they were arrows or spears. From that data, he came up with two equations. Basically, what you do is for each point that you're testing, you plug in the shoulder width to both equations, and the result with the larger number is the functional determination. This method proved to be 92% accurate for the confirmed arrows and 77% accurate for the spear points. This means that if you have a large enough data set, you'll be able to see trends in spear versus arrow-oriented morphology. While I was editing, I realized I needed to kind of jump back in and explain some things about this methodology and some issues that I've got with it. In principle, I think it's fine, but when you look through the list of the actual artifacts, the hafted artifacts that Schott used to build this methodology, almost all of them are from the west part of North America, and a few of them are from outside of North America in deserty kind of environments, which makes sense. That's going to give you the preservation quality that you actually need to get a spear point that is still attached to a perishable wooden foreshaft or haft or whatever it is. In the eastern woodlands, we've got a much broader range of tree species, and so it's entirely possible that bows made in the eastern woodlands are going to be higher poundage, stronger, and able to propel larger, heavier arrows that western tree species wouldn't be able to effectively propel. That is a hypothesis. I don't actually know. I would like to see that teased out a little bit better, because if it's the case that eastern points or eastern bows can launch arrows that are bigger and heavier than western bows can, then these metrics aren't going to be equally applicable on both sides of the continent. The other issue that I've got is that he doesn't report the dates of the artifacts that he's using to build this model. And if we don't have the dates for it, we could be looking at a series of arrow or projectile or spear points that are made after arrow points have diverged from spear points. There may have been an earlier time frame, where arrows and spears are made to be interchangeable. And if we're seeing only projectiles from a later period where the morphology of arrows has become radically different from the morphology of spears, then that's going to influence the efficacy of these equations, of this methodology. So in general, I think it works and it's probably good, but it's something that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to apply this thing to a totally different environment from what it was developed on. When we actually look at the results of the analysis of 190 points from William Spring with this method, we see an abrupt onset of arrow-oriented morphology associated with the Swan Lake point type. So while we can't say with certainty which Swan Lake points were spears and which were arrows, we can say that no points prior to this late Middle Woodland type fit the arrow morphology presented by Schott. Like I said, I have some issues with the underlying data used to construct this methodology, and I'm not certain that we can say that there were no arrows prior to the Swan Lake points in this region. but I am satisfied that Swan Lakes were at least partially designed to be used as arrows. We were also able to do some material source analysis. This chart comes from the site report, and it's illustrating the toolstone type frequency by percent from the early Archaic through the Middle Woodland period. There's a few noteworthy patterns here. First, early on, the predominant material is the Monteagle chert, which is extremely local. This is replaced in the Middle Archaic by Fort Payne as the favored material type. During the late Archaic, Monteagle becomes the preferred material again until the end of the Middle Woodland. But during the Capina phase here, we see a much broader range of materials represented more evenly than usual. The nearest sources for Monteagle are slightly closer than the closest Fort Payne sources, but both are to be found within the region. Alright, so I think I'll end this first chapter with some of the other stone tools that were recovered that don't really fit neatly within the bifacial tool PPK category. We got several different kinds of stone drills, which are frequently reworked out of old biface points. They're going to look like this. These could be used by hand. They can also be socketed into a bow drill or a pump drill to be used on wood or stone or even ceramic in some cases. These are much larger than the micro drills that we find, which are almost certainly, they would have to be socketed into some kind of wooden shaft. And these are likely used to drill small holes in things like stone or bone beads. Speaking of which, we also recovered several stone beads that were made from crinoid fossils, which are common in the region. They're already kind of tube-shaped. They're effectively pre-made. You just have to actually drill a hole through the center of them. We also got a handful of graving tools that have this telltale graver spur on them. These are generally thought to be used on engraving bone, possibly other softer materials. There were several digging hoes recovered. Remember that this is during the period that the Eastern Agricultural Complex is being actively practiced. Those sunflowers and May grass and things like that. So farming is actively ongoing at this time. These are typically pretty rough worked out of things like slate or limestone, and they're worn out from soil abrasion. Something else that I personally recovered, and is one of my favorite things that I found, is this split stone pipe bowl. The parabolic shape of the holes being drilled in suggests that it was drilled with a stone drill rather than a cane drill, which is another methodology that we see sometimes where you use a combination of the softwood cane and then grit, like a sand grit, to drill through stone. But we also found 2 cane drilled shale cores that were drilled out with cane and sand using this method. The pipe itself was made out of a siltstone, and it had fractured sometime after the holes had been drilled for the bowl and the stem, but before it had been finished off, the final construction. There's no what we call cake, the carbon buildup on the inside of the bowl. There's no cake on the inside of the bowl from it being smoked. So we're pretty sure it was discarded during a production failure. We, of course, got a handful of groundstone axe fragments in the Woodland Period Celt style. Most of them are, in fact, I think all of them were incomplete in some way, shape, or form, but we got about 15 of them. Some of them are made out of a, what's that stuff called? These were basically made from an indurated shale, and the rest of them were made from limestone. Finally, we got 2 stone plummets that we believe were probably used as loom weights. So that's all I've got left for this video. Remember that we've still got to go through all the ceramics. I've still got to make a whole video about the animal remains, the plant remains, and the features themselves, these pits that we were digging out to find these materials. There's a lot of interesting functional things about those as well. And then I've got to do something to kind of tie all this together and make more of a synthesis, which might be its own video, or I'll work it out as I go and see how long those shoots take. But if you have any questions or comments, you can throw those down in the description. I always look forward to reading them. And as always, thank you for watching.